The storm descended from the mountains like a wrathful god, swallowing the Nevada landscape in a fury of white that transformed the world into a frozen hell. And Catherine Pierce knew with absolute certainty that she was going to die out here alone. The wind howled through the rocky passes with such ferocity that it threatened to tear her from her horse. But the animal had already made its decision, bucking and rearing in terror, before bolting back down the trail they had climbed, leaving Catherine sprawling in a snowdrift that came up to her knees. She called after the mare, her voice lost immediately in the roar of the blizzard, and watched helplessly as the dark shape disappeared into the wall of white. Her fingers were already numb despite her gloves, and the thin traveling cloak she wore might as well have been paper for all the protection it offered against the savage cold that bit through to her bones. This was supposed to have been simple. Catherine had left Tonopah Junction that morning with supplies for the mining camp up in the mountains, a route she had traveled a dozen times since her father's death 6 months ago. Someone had to keep the family business running, and her younger brother was only 15, too young to make the treacherous journey alone. The sky had been clear when she set out, the February air cold but manageable. But weather in the mountains of Nevada in 1876 was as unpredictable as a rattlesnake, and the storm had rolled in with shocking speed, transforming a familiar path into an alien landscape where every direction looked the same. Catherine stumbled forward, knowing she had to find shelter or at least some protection from the wind. Her eyes streamed tears that froze on her cheeks, and her breath came in gasping sobs that hurt her chest. The pack she had been carrying was gone, lost when the horse threw her, and with it went the matches, the food, and the extra blanket. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a growing conviction that she had made a terrible mistake in thinking she could manage her father's routes alone. The world tilted suddenly, and Catherine realized she had walked off a small embankment, tumbling down into a gully that at least offered some small respite from the direct assault of the wind. She lay there for a moment, trying to catch her breath, trying to think. Her body was starting to feel heavy, her thoughts sluggish. She knew enough about cold to recognize the danger signs. If she stayed here, if she let herself rest, she would never wake up. But the alternative was to keep moving through a storm that showed no signs of letting up, with no idea which direction might lead to safety. Catherine forced herself to her knees, then to her feet, swaying like a drunkard. She would walk. She would keep walking until she found something, anything. The gully seemed to lead somewhere, and at least here the walls blocked some of the wind. She put one foot in front of the other, counting each step because it gave her mind something to focus on besides the cold and the fear. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her father had taught her that. When things got hard, you just kept counting, kept moving forward. She had reached 217 when she saw the shadow. At first, Catherine thought it was a trick of the storm, a darker patch of swirling snow that her desperate mind had shaped into the figure of a man. But then it moved, resolving into something solid and real, and she tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper, her throat raw from the cold air. The figure kept moving, and Catherine realized with horror that it was going to pass by without seeing her, that her one chance at salvation was about to disappear into the white. She stumbled forward, trying to run, and collapsed face first into the snow. The cold was actually starting to feel warm now, which some distant part of her mind recognized as a very bad sign. Catherine tried to push herself up, but her arms would not cooperate. She managed to roll onto her side, and that was when she saw the figure change direction, moving toward her with long, powerful strides that ate up the distance between them. Then he was there, dropping to one knee beside her, and Catherine found herself looking up into a face that seemed carved from the mountain itself. Hard planes and sharp angles, a strong jaw darkened with several days' worth of beard, and eyes the color of slate that widened in surprise at finding her there. His hair hung past his shoulders, dark and snow-dusted, and the rest of him was massive, broad shoulders straining against a heavy coat made of animal hides, arms thick with muscle even through the layers of clothing. "Jesus Christ," he said, and his voice was rough, deep as distant thunder. "What in the hell are you doing out here?" Catherine tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering so hard she could not form words. The man did not wait for a response. He pulled off one of his gloves and touched her face, and she felt the startling warmth of his hand against her frozen skin. "You are half dead already," he said, and there was something in his voice, anger maybe or fear. "Can you stand?" She tried, she honestly did, but her legs would not support her weight. The man caught her before she fell, and then without ceremony he was lifting her, scooping her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. Catherine wanted to protest, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity, but the simple truth was that she lacked the strength to do anything but let her head fall against his chest. "My cabin is not far," he said, and she felt the rumble of his voice through the thick furs he wore. "Stay awake. Do you hear me? Stay awake." Catherine tried to nod, but the world was starting to fade around the edges, darkness creeping in. The man said something else, something sharp, and gave her a small shake that sent a spike of clarity through the fog in her mind. "I said stay awake. Talk to me." "What is your name, Catherine?" she managed to whisper. "Catherine Pierce." "I am Benjamin," he said. "Benjamin Foster. Keep talking, Catherine. Where are you from?" "Tanapa Junction." Her words came out slurred, barely intelligible. "I was taking supplies to the mining camp. My horse bolted." "Damn fool thing to do in February," Benjamin said, but there was no real heat in the words. "The mining camp is 15 miles north of here. You have been walking in circles." Catherine would have laughed if she had the energy. Of course she had been. Of course. Benjamin moved through the storm with a confidence that spoke of years spent in these mountains, never hesitating, never slowing. Catherine could feel the power in his body, the strength in the arms that held her secure against his chest. He radiated heat like a forge, and she found herself pressing closer to that warmth, desperate for it. Time became meaningless. Catherine drifted, caught between consciousness and oblivion, aware only of the steady rhythm of Benjamin's stride and the sound of his voice urging her to stay awake. Then suddenly, they were moving through a doorway, and the howl of the wind became muffled, and there was blessed relief from the cutting edge of the cold. Benjamin set her down on something soft, and Catherine forced her eyes open to find herself in a small cabin, dim and shadowed but blessedly warm. A fire burned in a stone fireplace, and the single room was sparse but clean, with a few pieces of rough furniture and furs hanging on the walls. "I need to get you out of these wet clothes," Benjamin said, already working at the ties of her cloak with fingers that were surprisingly deft despite their size. "You are going into shock. Your body temperature is too low." Catherine tried to protest, but Benjamin cut her off with a look. "This is not about modesty," he said bluntly. "This is about keeping you alive. I have seen men die from cold, and it is not a good death. Now sit still." He peeled away her cloak, then her jacket, both garments stiff with ice. Her dress beneath was soaked through, the heavy fabric clinging to her skin. Benjamin made a sound of frustration and went to a chest against the wall, pulling out what looked like a shirt made of soft hide. "Can you undress yourself?" he asked, not looking at her. "Or do you need help?" "I can manage," Catherine said, though she was not at all certain that was true. Her fingers felt like blocks of wood, clumsy and unresponsive. Benjamin nodded and turned his back, busying himself at the fireplace, building up the fire until it roared and crackled. Catherine fumbled with the buttons of her dress, swearing under her breath as her numb fingers slipped and slid. It took an eternity, but finally she managed to work the dress off, then the layers of petticoats beneath, then her chemise and drawers, until she was left shivering in just her skin. She grabbed the hide shirt Benjamin had left and pulled it over her head. It was enormous on her, hanging to her knees, but it was dry and still held some warmth from wherever it had been stored. "I am decent," she said, her voice shaking. Benjamin turned, and something flickered in his eyes as he looked at her, sitting there wrapped in his shirt with her wet hair hanging in tangles around her face. He crossed to her in 2 strides and wrapped a heavy fur around her shoulders, then another, layering them until she was cocooned in warmth. "Sit closer to the fire," he said, guiding her to a low chair positioned near the hearth. "I am going to make you something hot to drink." Catherine watched as he moved about the cabin with economical efficiency, filling a battered pot with snow from a bucket near the door and setting it to heat over the flames. He added something from a leather pouch, and soon a rich, herbal smell filled the air. While the water heated, he knelt in front of Catherine and took her hands in his, rubbing them gently between his palms. The sensation was agonizing. As warmth returned to her frozen fingers, they began to burn and ache, and Catherine gasped at the pain. Benjamin did not stop, working each finger individually, his touch careful despite the obvious strength in his hands. "I know it hurts," he said quietly, "but this is good. It means there is no permanent damage. Can you feel your toes?" Catherine wiggled them experimentally inside her wet stockings. "Yes, they hurt too." "Good." Benjamin reached down and, before Catherine could protest, pulled off her boots and stockings, setting them near the fire to dry. Then he was rubbing her feet the same way he had rubbed her hands, his touch impersonal but gentle. And Catherine felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the fire. She studied him as he worked, taking in details she had missed in her initial desperation. He was younger than she had first thought, probably not yet 30, with a face that would have been handsome if not for the hardness in it, the wariness in those gray eyes. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked with them every day. He wore simple clothes, buckskin pants, and a shirt of rough wool, and everything about him spoke of a life lived in isolation, far from the company of others. "Why are you out here?" Catherine asked. "In the mountains, I mean, all alone." Benjamin glanced up at her, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then he returned his attention to her feet and said, "I prefer it this way, no complications, no expectations." "That sounds lonely." "Maybe." He set down her foot and rose, going to check on the pot over the fire. "But it is simple and safe." He poured the steaming liquid into a tin cup and brought it to her, guiding her hands around it. "Drink slowly. It will help warm you from the inside." Catherine sipped the brew and nearly choked. It was bitter and strongly herbal, with an undertone of something else she could not identify. But it was hot, and she felt its warmth spreading through her chest like liquid sunlight. She took another sip, more carefully this time. "What is in this?" she asked. "Willow bark for the pain, yarrow and elderberry for warmth, and a bit of whiskey because everything is better with whiskey." Benjamin settled himself on the floor near the fire, his long legs stretched out in front of him. "You were lucky I was out checking my trap line. Another hour and you would have been dead." "I know," Catherine said quietly. "Thank you, you saved my life." Benjamin shrugged, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same. But you are the one who did." Catherine took another drink, feeling strength beginning to return to her limbs. "How far are we from Tanapa Junction?" 20 miles as the crow flies. 30 by the trails. Benjamin looked toward the window, where the storm still raged, visible through gaps in the shutters. But no one is going anywhere until this blows over. These spring blizzards can last for days. Catherine felt a flutter of alarm. Days. Alone in a cabin with a strange man. But what choice did she have? The alternative had been to freeze to death in the snow. At least Benjamin had been respectful so far, had not done anything to make her fear for her safety. And there was something in his eyes, a fundamental decency that she found herself wanting to trust. "My brother will worry," she said. "Timothy, he is only 15. He will think something terrible has happened." "Something terrible did happen," Benjamin pointed out. "But you are alive, and once the storm clears I will help you get back to town. Until then, you rest and get your strength back." He stood and went to the far side of the cabin, where a narrow bed was built into the wall. He pulled off the furs that covered it and brought them back to Catherine, adding them to the pile already wrapped around her. "Those are from your bed," Catherine protested. "Where will you sleep?" "I will make do." Benjamin gestured to the pile of furs near the fire. "I have slept in worse places. You need the warmth more than I do." Catherine wanted to argue, but another wave of exhaustion washed over her, so profound that she could barely keep her eyes open. The combination of her near-death experience, the warmth of the fire, and whatever Benjamin had put in that drink was pulling her down into sleep despite her best efforts to resist. "That is right," Benjamin said softly. "Sleep. You are safe here, I promise." And despite everything, despite the strangeness of the situation and the fact that she knew nothing about this man beyond his name, Catherine believed him. She let her eyes close, let herself drift, and the last thing she was aware of was Benjamin draping another fur over her and the gentle crackle of the fire. Catherine woke to the sound of wind still howling outside and the smell of something cooking. For a moment she was disoriented, not recognizing her surroundings, and then memory returned in a rush. The storm. The cold. Benjamin. She sat up slowly, testing her body. Everything ached, her muscles protesting the abuse they had endured, but the terrible bone-deep cold was gone. The furs she had been wrapped in slid down, and she clutched at the hide shirt she wore, suddenly very aware of how little she had on beneath it. "You are awake." Benjamin turned from the fireplace, where he was tending a pot that hung from an iron hook. "How do you feel?" "Sore, but alive." Catherine looked around the cabin, seeing it more clearly now in the daylight that filtered through the shuttered windows. It was small but well-maintained, everything in its place. Traps and tools hung on the walls alongside the furs, and there was a workbench in one corner covered with what looked like supplies for curing hides. "What time is it?" "Near noon, I would guess. You slept through the night and most of the morning." Benjamin ladled something from the pot into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. "Eat. You need your strength." It was a stew of some kind, thick with meat and root vegetables. Catherine ate slowly, savoring each bite. She had not realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. "This is good," she said. "Did you hunt the meat yourself? Everything you see here I either hunted, trapped, or grew." There was a note of pride in Benjamin's voice. "I do not go into town often, maybe 3 or 4 times a year for the things I cannot make or find myself." Catherine studied him over the rim of her bowl. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly, and the sight made her breath catch slightly. He was striking, all hard muscle and masculine strength, with those penetrating gray eyes that seemed to see right through her. His hair, now dried from the snow, fell in dark waves to his shoulders, and she found herself wondering what it would feel like to run her fingers through it. She quickly pushed that thought away, disturbed by her own reaction. She had just met this man. She should not be having such thoughts. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked, trying to focus on something safe. 5 years. Benjamin settled himself on the floor again, his back against the wall. I came west after the war, did some soldiering, some scouting, eventually found my way up here and decided to stay. You fought in the war, Catherine did a quick calculation. The Civil War had ended 11 years ago. Benjamin must have been young when he enlisted, barely more than a boy. I did. His face closed off, his expression becoming shuttered. But that is not something I like to talk about. Catherine nodded, understanding. She had heard plenty of stories from the men who had fought, had seen the shadows that lingered in their eyes. Whatever Benjamin had experienced, it had been enough to drive him into isolation in these mountains. I am sorry, she said quietly. I did not mean to pry. Benjamin shook his head. You have a right to know something about the man whose cabin you are staying in. I just do not have much to tell. I live a simple life. I trap and hunt, tan hides, trade for what little I need. It suits me. But do you not get lonely? The question was out before Catherine could stop herself, and she immediately regretted it when she saw Benjamin's jaw tighten. Sometimes, he admitted after a long pause, but lonely is better than the alternative. Catherine wanted to ask what alternative he meant, but something in his expression warned her off. Instead, she finished her stew in silence, aware of the tension that had crept into the small space. Outside, the wind continued to scream, rattling the shutters. The storm showed no signs of abating. Tell me about Tanapa Junction, Benjamin said suddenly, clearly wanting to change the subject. What brings a woman like you to be running supplies up into the mountains? Catherine set down her bowl and pulled the furs more tightly around herself. My father died 6 months ago. Hart gave out one day while he was loading the wagon. He had built up a good business, supplying the mining camps and trading posts in the area. Someone had to keep it going, and my mother died when I was young. It is just me and my brother Timothy, and he is still too young to handle the routes alone. So you took over. Benjamin's expression had softened slightly. That is brave, or foolish, apparently. Catherine gestured toward the shuttered windows and the storm beyond. My father always said I had more courage than sense. There is nothing wrong with courage. Benjamin rose and checked the fire, adding another log. But courage needs to be tempered with caution. These mountains do not forgive mistakes. I have noticed, Catherine said dryly. Though to be fair, I have made this trip dozens of times without incident. The weather just turned on me faster than I expected. Benjamin nodded, his expression thoughtful as he watched the flames. February is the worst month for it. The storms come down from the high peaks without warning. Even I stay close to the cabin this time of year when I can. Yet you were out checking your trap line. I had to. Another day and any catches would have been ruined or dragged off by scavengers. He turned to look at her. Lucky for you I did. Yes, Catherine agreed softly. Lucky for me. Their eyes met and something passed between them, a moment of connection that made Catherine's heart beat faster. Benjamin looked away first, clearing his throat roughly. You should rest more, he said. Your body has been through an ordeal. Sleep will help it heal. Catherine wanted to protest that she had already slept half the day away, but another yawn caught her by surprise. Apparently, her body agreed with Benjamin's assessment. She lay back down, pulling the furs up to her chin, and watched as Benjamin moved about the cabin, tending to small tasks with quiet efficiency. She must have dozed off again, because when she next opened her eyes the light had changed, grown dimmer and more orange. Evening was approaching. Benjamin sat at his workbench, working on something with his hands, his profile lit by the firelight. What are you making? Catherine asked, her voice still thick with sleep. Benjamin glanced over at her. Mending a harness. One of the straps broke last week. He held up his work, showing her the leather he was carefully stitching. cannot afford to let equipment go unrepaired up here. Everything has to last." Catherine sat up, keeping the furs wrapped around her, and watched him work. His hands moved with practiced skill, the needle sliding through the tough leather with steady precision. There was something almost meditative about watching him, something that made her feel calm despite the strangeness of her situation. "I should check your fingers and toes again," Benjamin said after a few minutes. "Make sure there is no frostbite developing." He set aside his work and came over to her, kneeling down as he had the night before. Catherine extended her hands, and Benjamin took them in his own, examining each finger carefully, pressing gently to check the circulation. His touch was warm and sure, and Catherine found herself acutely aware of the contact, of the calluses on his palms and the strength in his grip. "They look good," Benjamin said. "No discoloration, no numbness. No, they feel fine." Catherine's voice came out slightly breathless, and she hoped he would attribute it to lingering effects of her ordeal rather than the way her pulse was racing from his touch. "Good. Let me see your feet." Catherine extended one foot from beneath the furs, and Benjamin cradled it in his hands, his thumb rubbing across her arch as he checked for damage. The sensation sent an unexpected shiver through her, and she bit her lip to keep from gasping. "Cold?" Benjamin asked, looking up at her with concern. "No, just ticklish." It was not quite a lie. Benjamin's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile, and Catherine realized it was the first time she had seen him come close to such an expression. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines, and she found herself wishing he would smile more often. "Everything looks healthy," Benjamin said, releasing her foot and standing. "You were very lucky. A few more minutes in that storm and you would have lost fingers or toes at least. I know. And I know I have already said it, but thank you, truly. You did not have to help me, but you did, and I will not forget that." Benjamin shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to gratitude. "Like I said, anyone would have done the same. But not everyone would have taken such good care of me after." Catherine gestured around the cabin. "You gave me your bed, your furs, your food. You have been nothing but kind. You needed help." Benjamin returned to his workbench, picking up the harness again as though he needed something to do with his hands. "And you are not exactly a burden. You have been unconscious or sleeping most of the time you have been here." Catherine smiled despite herself. "I will try to be more entertaining now that I am awake, then." Benjamin glanced at her, and this time there was definitely something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "I am not sure this cabin is equipped for entertainment. I am not much for conversation as a rule. Then I will have to do the talking for both of us." Catherine settled back against the wall, pulling the furs around her like a cocoon. "What would you like to know? I am an open book." "Why have you not married?" The question came out abruptly, as though Benjamin had not meant to ask it. "A woman like you, running a business in a town like Tanapa Junction, I would think you would have had plenty of offers." Catherine considered the question, trying to decide how honest to be. "I have had offers," she said slowly, "but none that interested me. Most men do not want a wife who has opinions of her own, who would rather drive a supply wagon than stay home and tend a garden. And after my father died, I inherited the business, which means I inherited a measure of independence. I am not eager to give that up to become some man's property." Benjamin had stopped working, his attention fully on her now. "Not all men are like that." "No," Catherine agreed, "but enough are. And I would rather be alone than with someone who wants to change who I am." She paused, then added, "What about you? Why have you never married?" Benjamin's expression shuddered again, and Catherine immediately regretted the question. But after a long moment he said, "I did marry. A long time ago when I was young and stupid. Her name was Sarah. She died." "Oh." Catherine felt something twist in her chest. "I am so sorry." It was a long time ago. Benjamin returned to his stitching, his movements more forceful now. I was 21, she was 19. We had been married less than a year when she got sick. Fever took her in 3 days. I could not do anything to save her. The pain in his voice was old but still raw, and Catherine understood suddenly why he had chosen to live alone in these mountains. He was protecting himself, keeping the world at a distance so he would never have to feel that kind of loss again. "That must have been terrible," she said softly. "It was." Benjamin set down the harness and stared into the fire. "After she died, I could not stay in that town anymore. Everything reminded me of her. So I joined the army, did some fighting, some scouting, and eventually ended up here, where no one knows me, and I do not have to pretend to be anything other than what I am." "Which is what?" Benjamin looked at her, and there was something vulnerable in his eyes, something that made Catherine's breath catch. "Broken," he said simply. "I do not think you are broken," Catherine said. "Hurt, maybe, but not broken. Broken things cannot be fixed. Hurt things can heal given time and the right circumstances." Benjamin held her gaze for a long moment, and Catherine saw something shift in his expression, a crack in the walls he had built around himself. Then he looked away, clearing his throat. "You should eat again," he said, his voice gruff. "I will heat up more stew." As Benjamin busied himself at the fire, Catherine leaned back and closed her eyes, thinking about the man who had saved her life. He was more complicated than she had first thought. Layers of pain and strength wrapped together in a body that looked like it had been carved from the mountains themselves. And despite his protestations that he preferred to be alone, she could see the loneliness in him, could sense the part of himself he had locked away after his wife's death. The storm continued to rage outside, and Catherine found herself oddly grateful for it. If the weather cleared too quickly, she would have to leave, would have to return to Tanapa Junction and her responsibilities there. And she was surprised to discover that she was not entirely ready to do that. There was something about this place, about this man, that called to her in a way she did not fully understand. They ate together in companionable silence, and afterward, Benjamin pulled out a worn deck of cards and taught Catherine a complicated game that involved more luck than skill. She lost spectacularly, which made Benjamin's lips twitch in that almost smile again, and Catherine found herself laughing, the sound bright and unexpected in the quiet cabin. "You are enjoying my suffering," she accused, throwing down a particularly bad hand. "Maybe a little," Benjamin admitted, and this time he did smile, a real smile that lit up his entire face and made him look years younger. Catherine's heart did a strange little flip in her chest, and she had to look away to hide her reaction. This was dangerous, she realized. She was starting to develop feelings for this man, feelings that were entirely inappropriate given that she had known him for barely a day. But there was something about him that drew her in, a combination of strength and vulnerability that made her want to know more, to peel back the layers he showed the world and discover the person underneath. They played cards until late into the evening, the conversation gradually becoming easier, more natural. Benjamin told her about life in the mountains, about the animals he hunted, and the changing seasons that dictated the rhythm of his existence. Catherine told him about Tanapa Junction, about the characters who lived there and the constant struggle to keep her father's business afloat in a town where opportunities came and went like the desert wind. Finally, Catherine could no longer keep her eyes open. Benjamin banked the fire and settled himself into the pile of furs near the hearth, insisting once again that Catherine take the bed. "You are sure?" Catherine asked, feeling guilty about displacing him for a second night. "I am sure," Benjamin said firmly. "Now sleep. The storm should break by tomorrow, and then we can figure out how to get you home." Catherine lay down and pulled the furs up to her chin, breathing in the scent of smoke and leather and something else that she was starting to recognize as uniquely Benjamin. Tomorrow. The word felt heavy, weighted with meaning. Tomorrow the storm would break, and this strange, suspended moment would end. She would go back to her life, and Benjamin would go back to his isolation, and they would both pretend that these 2 days had never happened. The thought made her chest ache. Catherine woke the next morning to silence. The wind had stopped. She sat up quickly, her heart sinking, and saw Benjamin already standing by the door, peering out through a crack in the shutters. "Storm has passed," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Sky is clearing. It will be cold, but the way down to town should be passable by midday." "Oh." Catherine tried to inject some enthusiasm into her voice and failed. "That is good news." Benjamin turned to look at her, and something in his expression suggested he was no more happy about the development than she was. "I will need to rig up a travois to pull you down. Your horse is long gone, and it is too far to walk in your condition." A travois. Catherine had heard the word but was not entirely sure what it meant. 2 poles with a platform between them. "I can harness myself to it and pull you down the mountain." Benjamin crossed to his workbench and began gathering supplies. "It will not be comfortable, but it will get you to town safely." Catherine stood, wrapping a fur around herself, and went to the window. Outside, the world had been transformed into a glittering white wonderland, everything covered in a thick blanket of fresh snow. It was beautiful and deadly, and she shuddered thinking about what would have happened if Benjamin had not found her. "How long will it take?" she asked. "To build the travois, I mean. A few hours. I have most of what I need." Benjamin pulled on his heavy coat and gloves. "I am going to cut some poles from the trees nearby. You should stay inside and keep warm. Your clothes should be dry by now if you want to change." He left before Catherine could respond, stepping out into the snow and closing the door firmly behind him. Catherine stood at the window and watched him stride away, his powerful form moving easily through the deep drifts, and felt an almost physical ache at the thought of leaving him. This was ridiculous. She barely knew him. But somehow, in the span of 2 days, Benjamin Foster had become important to her in a way she could not fully explain. He had saved her life, yes, but it was more than that. He had been kind to her, had shared parts of himself that she suspected he showed to no one else, had looked at her with those gray eyes in a way that made her feel seen in a manner she never had before. Catherine forced herself to turn away from the window and focus on practical matters. Her clothes were indeed dry, hanging near the fire where Benjamin must have arranged them while she slept. She dressed quickly, grateful to be back in her own things even though the hide shirt and furs had been comfortable. As she fastened the buttons of her dress, she tried to prepare herself mentally for the journey back to town, for the return to her regular life. But her heart was not cooperating. Her heart wanted to stay here in this small cabin with the quiet man who had wrapped her in furs and kept her safe through the storm. Benjamin returned an hour later with 2 long, straight poles, his face flushed from exertion and cold. He set to work immediately, lashing the poles together with strips of leather, weaving a platform between them from what looked like woven willow branches. Catherine watched, fascinated by the skill with which he worked, the way his hands knew exactly what to do. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. "Army scouts taught me. Useful skill when you are trying to move wounded men and do not have a wagon." Benjamin tested the strength of his knots, pulling hard to make sure they would hold. "This should support your weight easily enough. I will pad it with furs to make it more comfortable." He was being all business now, focused and efficient, and Catherine wondered if he was deliberately avoiding looking at her too closely. She wanted to say something, wanted to break through the sudden distance between them, but she did not know what words to use. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the travois was complete. Benjamin packed supplies into a large leather bag, including food, water, and extra furs, and then looked at Catherine. "Ready?" he asked. "No," Catherine wanted to say. "I am not ready at all." But instead, she nodded and let Benjamin help her onto the platform. He wrapped her in furs until she was thoroughly cocooned, only her face exposed to the cold air. "It will take about 4 hours to reach town, maybe 5 depending on how the trails are," Benjamin said, strapping the harness across his chest. "Tell me if you need to stop for any reason." Then he was moving, the travois sliding smoothly over the snow behind him, and they were leaving the cabin behind. Catherine twisted to look back at the small structure, already starting to disappear among the trees, and felt tears prick her eyes. The journey down the mountain was surreal. Benjamin moved steadily through the snow, following paths that Catherine could barely see, navigating around obstacles with practiced ease. The world around them was breathtakingly beautiful, all white and blue and sharp with cold, but Catherine barely noticed. She was too focused on the man pulling her down the mountain, on the set of his broad shoulders and the way his breath plumed in the frigid air. They stopped once to rest and eat, and Benjamin checked on her carefully, making sure she was not getting too cold, that the furs were still secure. His touch was gentle but impersonal, and Catherine found herself missing the warmth that had been in his eyes back at the cabin. "Benjamin," she said as he was preparing to set off again, "I want to thank you for everything, not just for saving my life but for taking care of me, for being kind." Benjamin looked at her, and for a moment that careful distance dropped away and she saw the same longing she felt reflected in his face. But then he shook his head slightly and looked away. "You do not owe me anything," he said gruffly. "I am just glad I found you in time." He picked up the harness again, and they continued down the mountain. Tanapa Junction appeared in the distance as the sun was beginning to set. A scatter of wooden buildings huddled in a valley between the mountains. Catherine felt her stomach twist with a complicated mix of relief and regret. She was home, or close enough. But that meant this journey was ending, and she was not ready for that. People began to emerge from buildings as they entered the town, drawn by the strange sight of Benjamin pulling the travois. Catherine saw her brother Timothy push his way through the small crowd that was gathering, his young face pale with worry. "Catherine," he reached the travois and dropped to his knees beside it. "We thought you were dead. When your horse came back without you and the storm hit, we thought," his voice broke. "I am fine, Timothy. This man saved my life." Catherine gestured to Benjamin, who had removed the harness and was standing slightly apart, watching the reunion with an unreadable expression. Timothy stood and went to Benjamin, grabbing his hand and pumping it enthusiastically. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I do not know how to repay you." "No repayment necessary," Benjamin said, extricating his hand gently. "I did what anyone would do." "Let's get you to Doc Harrison," Timothy said, turning back to Catherine. "Make sure there is no lasting damage." Several men from the crowd came forward to help, and soon Catherine was being carried into the doctor's office. Surrounded by concerned faces and questions, she did not have the energy to answer. She looked back over her shoulder, searching for Benjamin, but he had already melted away into the growing darkness. Her heart sank. Dr. Harrison examined her thoroughly and pronounced her remarkably healthy considering her ordeal, with no signs of frostbite or infection. He insisted she stay off her feet for a few days to recover her strength, and Timothy helped her home to the small house they shared behind the mercantile that had been their father's pride and joy. Over the next few days, Catherine found herself unable to stop thinking about Benjamin. She went through the motions of her daily routine, fielding well wishes from townspeople and catching up on business matters that had accumulated during her absence. But her mind kept drifting back to that small cabin in the mountains, to the quiet man with the gray eyes who had wrapped her in furs and kept her safe through the storm. She found herself telling Timothy the story, describing Benjamin and his cabin, and the way he lived alone in the wilderness. Her brother listened with the rapt attention of a boy who dreamed of adventure, asking questions about Benjamin's trapping and hunting techniques. "He sounds like quite a man," Timothy said thoughtfully. "You think he ever comes to town?" "He said he only visits 3 or 4 times a year for supplies." Catherine stared into the fire in their small parlor, hugging a cup of tea. "I doubt I will see him again." The thought hurt more than it should have. A week passed, then 2. Catherine threw herself into work, taking inventory, organizing supply runs for when the weather improved, managing the books. But everything felt flat somehow, colorless. She caught herself looking toward the mountains whenever she was outside, wondering what Benjamin was doing, if he was thinking about her at all. She told herself she was being ridiculous. They had spent barely 2 days together. That was not enough time to develop real feelings for someone. But her heart disagreed with the logic of her mind. Her heart remembered the way Benjamin had looked at her in the firelight, the careful way he had touched her when checking for frostbite, the vulnerability in his voice when he told her about his wife. Then, 3 weeks after the storm, Catherine was working in the mercantile when the bell above the door rang. She looked up from the ledger she had been studying and froze. Benjamin stood in the doorway, looking impossibly large in the confines of the shop, his fur coat dusted with snow. His gray eyes found hers immediately, and Catherine felt her heart leap into her throat. "Hello, Catherine," he said, his deep voice sending shivers down her spine. "Benjamin." Catherine set down her pen with shaking hands. "What are you doing here? I needed supplies." He gestured vaguely at the shelves around them. "And I wanted to make sure you recovered fully from your ordeal." Catherine came around the counter, unable to stop herself from moving closer to him. "I am perfectly well, thanks to you. Dr. Harrison said I was remarkably lucky." "Good." "That is good." Benjamin shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. "I am glad." They stood there staring at each other for a long moment, and Catherine was acutely aware of the other people in the shop watching them with undisguised curiosity. Mrs. Henderson, the town busybody, was practically vibrating with interest. "Would you like some help gathering your supplies?" Catherine asked. "I can show you what we have in stock." "Yes, thank you." Benjamin followed her deeper into the shop, away from the prying eyes. "What do you need?" Catherine kept her voice low, aware that Mrs. Henderson was still trying to eavesdrop. "Coffee, flour, salt, ammunition." Benjamin rattled off a list of basics. "And some tobacco if you have it." Catherine began gathering items and Benjamin helped her, reaching things on high shelves with ease. They worked together in silence, but it was a charged silence, full of things neither of them was saying. "Benjamin," Catherine said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you really come here?" Benjamin set down the bag of flour he had been holding and turned to face her fully. "Because I could not stop thinking about you," he said bluntly. "I tried. God knows I tried. But every night I sit in that cabin and see you wrapped in my furs by the fire, and I cannot get the image out of my head. I told myself I was being a fool, that you would have forgotten all about me by now. But I had to see you one more time, even if just to confirm that what I felt was one-sided." Catherine's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "It is not one-sided," she whispered. "I have thought about you every day since you brought me back to town. I have missed you, which is absurd because I barely know you, but it is true. Benjamin took a step closer, and Catherine could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scent of pine and leather that clung to him. "What do we do about that?" he asked quietly. "I do not know." Catherine looked up at him, at the hope and fear warring in his gray eyes. "You live in the mountains. I live here. I have responsibilities, a business to run, a brother to care for. I know." Benjamin reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch feather light. "I am not asking you to give up your life. I have no right to ask that. But I am asking if I can court you properly. Come to town more often, spend time with you, see if what we both feel is real or just a product of extraordinary circumstances." "Yes." The word came out before Catherine could even think about it. "Yes, I would like that very much." Benjamin smiled then, that rare, transformative smile that made her knees weak. "Good. Then I will come back next week. Maybe you could show me around town properly, introduce me to people." "I would love to." Catherine felt like she was floating, like her feet had left the ground entirely. They finished gathering Benjamin's supplies, and Catherine rang up the purchase with trembling hands. Benjamin paid and then hesitated at the door. "1 week," he said, his eyes holding hers. "1 week," Catherine confirmed. Then he was gone, disappearing into the snowy street, and Catherine leaned against the counter, trying to catch her breath. "Well," said Mrs. Henderson, appearing at her elbow with alarming speed. "Who was that?" "The man who saved my life," Catherine said, unable to keep the smile off her face. "His name is Benjamin Foster." The next week passed in a blur of anticipation. Catherine found herself paying more attention to her appearance, fussing with her hair and changing her dress twice each morning. Timothy noticed and teased her mercilessly, but she did not care. She felt alive in a way she had not in years, maybe ever. Benjamin arrived exactly 1 week later, riding into town on a sturdy mountain horse, and Catherine's heart soared at the sight of him. He had trimmed his beard slightly, and his hair was tied back, and he looked both wild and civilized at the same time. They walked through Tonopah Junction together, Catherine pointing out various businesses and introducing Benjamin to the people they encountered. Some of the townspeople were wary of the mountain man at first, but Benjamin's quiet courtesy and obvious devotion to Catherine won them over quickly. Mrs. Henderson practically glowed with approval, no doubt already composing the gossip she would spread. They had dinner at the small restaurant on Main Street, sitting across from each other at a corner table and talking for hours. Catherine told Benjamin more about her life, about her dreams for the business and her worries about Timothy's future. Benjamin told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about his family lost to the war and disease, about the years he had spent wandering before finding his place in the Nevada mountains. "I never thought I would want to be around people again," Benjamin admitted over coffee. "After Sarah died, I was convinced that isolation was the only way to avoid that kind of pain. But you make me want to try. You make me think that maybe closing myself off was not the answer." Catherine reached across the table and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "We have both been hurt," she said softly, "but maybe we can help each other heal." Benjamin raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, the gesture so tender it brought tears to Catherine's eyes. "I would like that," he said. After that evening, Benjamin began coming to town regularly. Once a week at first, then twice, then 3 times. He would arrive in the morning and spend the day with Catherine, helping her with heavy lifting at the mercantile, accompanying her on supply runs to nearby homesteads, sitting with her in the evening while she did bookwork, and Timothy did his lessons. The townspeople of Tonopah Junction grew accustomed to seeing the mountain man around, and slowly Benjamin began to relax, the hard edges of his isolation wearing smooth. He smiled more easily, laughed at jokes, even joined in the occasional card game at the saloon. Catherine watched him transform with a heart full of joy. This was the man Benjamin had been before grief and war had hardened him, she thought. This was the man he could be again, given love and patience and time. Spring came to Nevada, melting the snow and turning the desert green with unexpected wildflowers. Catherine and Benjamin spent a Sunday hiking into the foothills, and they found a meadow carpeted in purple lupines and golden poppies. They sat together on a sun-warmed rock, and Benjamin pulled Catherine against his chest, wrapping his arms around her. "I love you," he said, the words simple and direct. "I have loved you since I found you in that storm, half frozen and stubborn as hell. You have given me back something I thought I had lost forever." Catherine turned in his arms so she could see his face. "What is that, Hope?" Benjamin cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "The hope that life can be more than just survival. The hope that I can be whole again." "You were always whole," Catherine whispered. "You just needed someone to see it." Benjamin kissed her then, softly at first, then deeper, and Catherine felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. She had been kissed before, by boys who thought they had a right to her affection, but this was different. This was a claiming and a surrender all at once, a promise of everything they could be together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Benjamin rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast, and I know I am asking you to take a chance on a man who lives in the wilderness. But I swear to you, Catherine, I will spend every day of my life making you happy." "Yes," Catherine said, joy bubbling up through her chest. "Yes, I will marry you." They planned a summer wedding, giving themselves time to figure out the logistics of combining their lives. Benjamin could not imagine living in town permanently, and Catherine could not abandon her business and her brother. After much discussion, they arrived at a compromise. They would split their time between the cabin and Tonopah Junction, spending the harsh winter months in town where Catherine could manage the business and Timothy could attend school, and the milder seasons at the cabin where Benjamin could trap and hunt. Timothy was delighted with the arrangement. At 15, he was old enough to handle the mercantile with supervision, and the idea of spending summers in the mountains learning to trap and hunt from Benjamin filled him with excitement. They were married in June, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Tonopah Junction. Catherine wore a dress of cream-colored silk that had belonged to her mother, and Benjamin wore new clothes purchased for the occasion, though he still looked wild and untamed even in town clothes. The entire population of Tonopah Junction turned out for the wedding, and the celebration afterward lasted until dawn. On their wedding night, Benjamin carried Catherine across the threshold of his cabin, which he had spent weeks preparing for her arrival. He had built new furniture, including a larger bed, and had hung curtains at the windows and laid down rugs on the floor. It was still rustic, but it was clean and comfortable, and Catherine felt tears spring to her eyes at the obvious care he had taken. "Welcome home," Benjamin said, setting her down gently. Catherine looked around the cabin that had saved her life months ago, and then looked at the man who had saved her in more ways than one. "I am home," she agreed. Their first year of marriage was an adjustment, learning to navigate the rhythms of each other's lives. There were disagreements, of course. Catherine sometimes felt stifled by the isolation of the cabin, and Benjamin sometimes struggled with the bustle and noise of town life. But they worked through each challenge with patience and love, always coming back to the fundamental truth that they were better together than apart. Benjamin proved to be a devoted husband, attentive and protective without being controlling. He encouraged Catherine to continue running the business, even helped her expand it by introducing her to trading contacts among the mountain trappers. Catherine, in turn, helped Benjamin reconnect with the parts of himself he had locked away, encouraging him to talk about his past, to grieve properly for what he had lost, to open himself to the possibility of a future he had never dared to imagine. Timothy thrived under Benjamin's mentorship, growing strong and capable under the mountain man's tutelage. He learned to track and hunt, to read the weather and navigate by the stars, and Benjamin seemed to take genuine pleasure in passing on his skills to the eager boy. A year and a half after their wedding, Catherine realized she was pregnant. She told Benjamin one evening as they sat by the fire in the cabin, and she watched his face transform with wonder and fear. "A baby," he said, his hand trembling as he placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." "You are happy?" Catherine asked, suddenly uncertain. They had never explicitly discussed children. "Happy." Benjamin pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Catherine, I am terrified and overjoyed and 100 other things I cannot even name. A baby. Our baby." Their son was born in February, in the house in Tanapa Junction with Dr. Harrison in attendance and half the women of the town waiting downstairs with casseroles and advice. It was a difficult birth, lasting nearly 20 hours, and Benjamin paced the hallway like a caged animal until the doctor finally emerged to tell him he had a healthy son. Benjamin burst into the bedroom to find Catherine exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and when Catherine pulled back the blanket to show him their son's face, Benjamin broke down and wept. "He is perfect," Benjamin managed through his tears. "You are both perfect." They named the baby Thomas, after Catherine's father, and he grew to be the image of his father, with Benjamin's dark hair and gray eyes. 2 years later, Catherine gave birth to a daughter they named Emma, who had her mother's delicate features and her father's stubbornness. Then another son, Henry, who was quieter than his siblings but with a clever mind that surprised them all. As their family grew, so did their life together. Benjamin built additions onto the cabin, expanding it to accommodate their growing brood. Catherine's business flourished, and eventually Timothy was old enough to take over the day-to-day management, freeing Catherine to spend more time in the mountains with her husband and children. The children grew up wild and free, equally at home in town and in the wilderness. Thomas became a skilled tracker like his father. Emma developed a head for business that rivaled her mother's. Henry discovered a talent for drawing and spent hours sketching the wildlife and landscapes around them. Timothy married a girl from town named Sarah, a sweet-natured woman who reminded Benjamin painfully of his first wife, though he learned to separate the two in his mind, to honor his past while embracing his present. Timothy and Sarah had 3 children of their own, and the cousins grew up together, filling the cabin and the house in town with laughter and chaos. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growing of children. Benjamin's hair began to gray at the temples, and laugh lines appeared around Catherine's eyes. But the love between them never faded. If anything, it deepened, maturing like good whiskey, becoming richer and more complex with time. They would still sometimes talk about that storm, about the night Benjamin found Catherine half frozen in a gully and wrapped her in furs until dawn. It had become part of their family mythology, the story the children begged to hear over and over. "Tell us again about how you met Mama," Thomas would say, and Benjamin would pull Catherine close and begin the tale, always starting with the same words. "It was the worst storm I had ever seen, and I was checking my trap lines when I found the most stubborn woman in Nevada about to freeze to death in a snowbank." And Catherine would laugh and swat his arm and add her own details about how terrified she had been, about how Benjamin had looked like some kind of mountain god emerging from the storm, about how she had fallen in love with him somewhere between the moment he picked her up and the moment she woke wrapped in his furs. It was fate, Emma would say, romantic even as a child. It was luck, Henry would counter pragmatically. It was love, Benjamin would say, looking at Catherine with those gray eyes that still made her heart race after all these years. Pure and simple, it was love. On their 20th anniversary, Benjamin took Catherine back to the meadow where he had proposed, the same spot carpeted in lupines and poppies. They were older now, their bodies marked by time and hard work and the bearing of children, but they sat on the same sun-warmed rock and held hands like newlyweds. "You ever regret it?" Benjamin asked. "Marrying a mountain man, splitting your life between town and wilderness?" Catherine looked at him, at the man who had saved her life and captured her heart, at the father of her children and the partner of her soul. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything I never knew I wanted." "You gave me back my life," Benjamin said, bringing her hand to his lips. "I was just existing before you, Catherine, surviving but not living. You made me believe in tomorrow again." They sat together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Below them, they could see the cabin where their children were probably running wild, and beyond that the mountains that had witnessed their love story from the beginning. "Tell me again," Catherine said softly, "about the night you found me." Benjamin smiled and pulled her close, and began the story they both knew by heart. The story of a mountain man and a stubborn woman, and a storm that had brought them together against all odds. As he spoke, Catherine closed her eyes and remembered the feel of those furs wrapped around her, the warmth of Benjamin's hands checking for frostbite. The moment she had opened her eyes to find him looking down at her with concern and something that might have been the beginning of love. The storm had been meant to kill her, but instead it had given her life. Real life, full and rich and complicated and beautiful. She had set out that February morning to deliver supplies and had found instead the other half of her soul, wrapped in furs and mountain wisdom and a heart that had been waiting for her all along. Years continued to pass, each one adding new chapters to their story. Benjamin taught their sons and daughters everything he knew about surviving in the wilderness, about respecting nature and living in harmony with the land. Catherine taught them about business and responsibility and the importance of family and community. Together, they created a legacy that was greater than either of them could have built alone. When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to become a guide, leading parties of settlers and prospectors through the mountains. Benjamin helped him prepare, teaching him the most difficult routes and the hidden dangers. Emma took over more of the mercantile operations, showing a business acumen that impressed even Catherine. Henry went east to study art, but he always came home for the summers, filling sketchbooks with images of the mountains and the family he loved. Timothy's children grew as well, and soon the family was so large that gatherings required careful planning and plenty of space. But whether they met at the cabin or in town, there was always laughter and love, always the sense that they were part of something special, something that had started with a storm and a rescue, and two lonely people finding each other against impossible odds. Benjamin and Catherine grew old together, their bodies slowing but their spirits still strong. They still split their time between cabin and town, though as the years advanced, they spent more time in Tonopah Junction where the weather was easier and the doctor was closer. But the cabin remained their refuge, the place where their love had truly begun. On a February evening 42 years after the storm that had brought them together, Benjamin and Catherine sat by the fire in their cabin, watching the snow fall outside. Their children were grown, scattered across Nevada and beyond, living their own lives and raising their own families. But tonight it was just the two of them, the way it had been in the beginning. "Do you remember," Catherine said, her voice soft with age but still strong, "how terrified I was that night? I was certain I was going to die." "I remember," Benjamin said, his arm around her shoulders. "I remember thinking I had never seen anyone so beautiful, even half frozen and covered in snow." Catherine laughed. "You are a terrible liar, Benjamin Foster. I looked like a drowned rat. A beautiful drowned rat." Benjamin kissed the top of her head. "The moment I saw you, I knew my life was going to change. I did not know how, but I knew." "Mine too," Catherine admitted. "Even through the fear and the cold, there was something about you, something that made me feel safe." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance and listening to the wind outside. It was not the howling fury of that long-ago storm, just the gentle whisper of a Nevada winter night. "Thank you," Benjamin said suddenly. "For what?" "For saying yes. For taking a chance on a broken mountain man who did not know how to be part of the world anymore. For giving me a family and a future and a reason to wake up every morning." Benjamin's voice was thick with emotion. "You saved my life just as surely as I saved yours that night." Catherine turned in his arms so she could see his face, still handsome despite the lines of age, those gray eyes still capable of making her heart flutter. "We saved each other," she corrected. "That is what love does. It saves us from ourselves, from our loneliness and our fear. It makes us whole." Benjamin cupped her face in his hands, just as he had in that meadow so many years ago, and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion of a young man in love. Catherine kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into that kiss, all the love and gratitude and joy that had filled the years they had spent together. When they finally pulled apart, both smiling, Catherine rested her head on Benjamin's shoulder and sighed with contentment. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and gentle, blanketing the world in white. But inside the cabin, wrapped in warmth and love and the memories of a lifetime spent together, Catherine and Benjamin Foster were exactly where they were meant to be. The storm that had threatened to end Catherine's life had instead given her everything. It had led her to Benjamin, had forced them together in circumstances that stripped away pretense and revealed the truth of who they were. And from that truth had grown something beautiful and enduring, a love story that would be told and retold by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a testament to the power of fate and courage, and two hearts brave enough to take a chance on each other. As the fire burned low and the night deepened, Benjamin carried Catherine to their bed, just as he had carried her to safety all those years ago. He wrapped her in blankets and furs, holding her close, and Catherine fell asleep with a smile on her face, secure in the knowledge that she was loved completely and utterly by the mountain man who had found her in a blizzard and wrapped her in furs until dawn. Their story, which had begun with a storm, would continue in the hearts and lives of all those they touched, a legacy of love that would endure long after the snow had melted and the mountains themselves had worn away. Because some love stories are too powerful to be contained by a single lifetime. Some love stories echo through the ages, inspiring others to be brave, to take chances, to believe in the possibility of finding someone who sees you, truly sees you, and loves you anyway. Benjamin and Catherine Foster had found that kind of love in the most unlikely of circumstances, and they had spent every day of their lives honoring it, nurturing it, and sharing it with everyone around them. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift the storm had given them. Not just each other, but the opportunity to show the world what real love looked like. As dawn broke over the Nevada mountains the next morning, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Benjamin woke to find Catherine still sleeping peacefully in his arms. He watched her face, memorizing every line and curve as he had done countless times before, and felt his heart swell with gratitude. They had been given a miracle that February night so long ago. Two people who had been lost had found each other in the midst of a storm, and from that chance encounter had bloomed a love that sustained them through all the joys and sorrows of life. They had built a family, created a legacy, and found meaning in the simple act of loving each other through every season, every challenge, every triumph. Catherine stirred, her eyes opening to meet Benjamin's gaze, and she smiled the smile that was his alone, the one she had given him since the very beginning. "Good morning," she whispered. "Good morning," Benjamin whispered back, kissing her forehead. "I love you." "I love you too," Catherine said, snuggling closer. "Forever and always. Forever and always." It was a promise they had made to each other 42 years ago, and it was a promise they had kept through all the years since. And as they lay together in the cabin where their story had truly begun, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a love well earned, both Catherine and Benjamin knew that their forever was far from over. The mountains would continue to stand, the seasons would continue to change, and their love would continue to endure, as constant and enduring as the Nevada landscape itself. And somewhere, in the swirling snow and the howling wind, the ghost of that long-ago storm seemed to whisper its approval, satisfied that the two souls it had brought together had made the most of the gift they had been given. The years that followed were gentle ones. Benjamin and Catherine spent their days surrounded by family, welcoming grandchildren and great-grandchildren into their home, passing on the stories and values that had sustained them. They walked the mountain trails together when weather permitted, sat by the fire when it did not, and never once took for granted the precious gift of another day together. On Catherine's 70th birthday, the family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. Children ran through the woods, grandchildren helped prepare food, and great-grandchildren toddled around on unsteady legs. Benjamin stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the chaos with a smile, and felt Catherine slip her hand into his. "Look what we made," she said softly, gesturing to the 3 generations of family that bore their legacy. "Look what you made," Benjamin corrected. "I was just a hermit living in a cave before you came along." Catherine laughed, the sound as bright as it had been when she was 23. "It was a cabin, not a cave. And you were never just anything, Benjamin Foster. You were always extraordinary. You just needed someone to see it." They stood together, hands clasped, watching their family celebrate under the Nevada sky. Thomas was teaching his son to track, pointing out signs in the forest floor. Emma was negotiating with one of her children about dessert before dinner, her business mind never quite turning off even at a party. Henry had set up an easel and was capturing the scene in watercolors, his artistic eye finding beauty in the ordinary moments. "We did good," Benjamin said, his voice rough with emotion. "We did great," Catherine agreed. As the sun began to set, and the party showed no signs of slowing down, Benjamin pulled Catherine close and began to dance, right there in the clearing with no music but the sound of family and wind in the trees. Catherine followed his lead, their bodies remembering the steps even if their joints protested slightly, and they swayed together in the fading light. "Thank you for finding me," Catherine whispered against his chest. "Thank you for staying," Benjamin whispered back. And as they danced beneath the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, surrounded by the family they had built and the love they had nurtured, both Benjamin and Catherine knew that they had been blessed beyond measure. The storm that had brought them together had been a gift, unexpected and precious, and they had spent every moment since honoring that gift by living fully, loving completely, and creating something beautiful from the ashes of their individual pasts. Their story, which had started with a mountain man finding a stranded woman in a blizzard and wrapping her in furs until dawn, had become so much more than a simple rescue. It had become a testament to the power of love to heal, to transform, to create meaning where there had been none before. It had become a legacy that would live on in the hearts and lives of everyone they touched, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the very best, if we are brave enough to embrace the unexpected and wise enough to recognize a miracle when it appears. As full dark fell and the family finally began to settle, building up the fire and spreading blankets for those who would stay the night, Benjamin and Catherine retreated to their cabin, leaving the celebration to the younger generations. They prepared for bed with the practiced ease of a couple who had shared 1,000 such nights, and when they finally lay down together, Catherine tucked into her favorite position with her head on Benjamin's chest. Both of them sighed with contentment. "One more day," Benjamin said softly, as he had said every night for 42 years. "One more day," Catherine agreed, as she had agreed every night for 42 years. It was their ritual, their way of acknowledging that every day together was a gift, never to be taken for granted. And as they drifted off to sleep, safe and warm and surrounded by love, the mountains stood watch over them, eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to a love story for the ages. The end came peacefully for both of them, years later, within months of each other. Benjamin went first, his heart simply stopping one night in his sleep, a gentle passing that Catherine both mourned and was grateful for. She knew he would not have wanted a long, painful decline, would not have wanted to become a burden. He went as he had lived, on his own terms, with dignity intact. Catherine followed 3 months later, her body finally giving in to the accumulated years. But she went with a smile on her face, her last words a whisper of Benjamin's name, and those who were with her said she looked like a young woman again in that final moment, as though she could see something beyond that filled her with joy. They were buried together in a small cemetery overlooking the valley, their graves marked by a simple stone that read, "Benjamin and Catherine Foster," two souls who found each other in a storm and loved through all seasons. The epitaph had been chosen by their children, and it captured perfectly the essence of their parents' story. Years after their passing, their great-great-grandchildren would visit that grave and hear the story of how their ancestors met, about the blizzard and the rescue and the love that followed. They would hear about Benjamin's cabin and Catherine's courage, about the life they built together and the family they created. And they would understand that they were part of something special, something that had started with an act of compassion on a frozen mountain and had rippled outward to touch countless lives. The cabin still stood in the mountains, maintained by the family as a memorial and a retreat. On the anniversary of the storm that had brought Benjamin and Catherine together, family members would gather there, sharing stories and keeping alive the memory of two people who had proven that love could conquer even the coldest winter, the deepest loneliness, the most profound loss. And sometimes, on February nights when the snow fell soft and silent over the Nevada mountains, those staying in the cabin swore they could feel a presence there, something warm and protective that wrapped around them like furs, keeping them safe until dawn. They would smile and whisper thanks to Benjamin and Catherine, knowing that some love is so strong it transcends even death, lingering on in the places and the hearts that held it close. The storm that had threatened to be an ending had instead been a beginning, the start of something beautiful and enduring that would echo through generations. And in the end, that was the true miracle. Not that Benjamin had found Catherine in the blizzard, but that they had found in each other the courage to love again, to build again, to hope again. They had taken the worst night of Catherine's life and transformed it into the foundation of a love story that would inspire others long after they were gone. Their legacy lived on in every child who learned to be brave, every adult who chose to love despite past hurts, every person who believed that sometimes fate intervenes at the exact right moment to bring together two souls who were meant to find each other. Benjamin and Catherine Foster had shown the world that love was worth fighting for, worth believing in, worth everything. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift they left behind.